My name is Lorena, and that morning I discovered that there is a kind of silence that only exists while almost everyone is still asleep. The clock read 4:30 when I opened my eyes. Outside, darkness covered the fields. The wind brushed gently against the walls of the house, and not a single light shone along the road. For a few seconds, I thought about going back to sleep. Then, I remembered the promise I had made the night before. I would prepare breakfast for the entire Amish family. It would not be a quick breakfast, made only to satisfy hunger. The family would wake up early to care for the animals, organize the house, and begin a long day of work. The table needed to be ready before everyone returned from the first chores of the morning. I had very little time, a lot of ingredients, and a kitchen that worked in a very different way from the one I was used to. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and follow this experience all the way to the end, because what began as a simple attempt to make breakfast turned into one of the most intense and meaningful mornings I have ever lived through. I thought the biggest challenge would be cooking for so many people, but before sunrise, I realized that this kitchen was going to teach me something much greater about time, work, and care. I got dressed, tied back my hair, and walked down the hallway as quietly as I could. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet. When I reached the kitchen, I found only the soft light of an oil lamp and the faint glow coming from the stove. There were no electric appliances humming, no notifications, and no engines. There were cast iron pans, large bowls, wooden spoons, and a long table waiting to be filled. On the counter, the mother of the family had left a simple note listing the ingredients I could use: eggs, bacon, potatoes, flour, milk, butter, apples, and bread. Beside it was a basket of onions, a few peppers, and a jar of homemade jam. I read the list twice and decided to make scrambled eggs with vegetables, golden potatoes, bacon, pancakes, cinnamon apples, and warm bread. It sounded ambitious, and it was. The family was large, and every pan had to hold enough food so that no one would leave the table hungry. I started with the potatoes because they would take the longest. I washed them one by one, cut them into pieces, and placed everything in a large bowl. As I worked, I heard movement outside, footsteps on the porch, a door opening, the distant sound of a bucket, and animals shifting inside the barn. It was still very early, but the house was already waking up in a different way. No one was rushing wildly from one place to another. There was no uncontrolled hurry. Each person seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. That made me look at my own counter more carefully. I needed to find a rhythm, too. I set the cast iron skillet on the stove and added butter. As it began to melt, spreading a warm smell through the kitchen, I added the potatoes. The sound was immediate. A strong sizzle broke the silence and made me feel that the morning had truly begun. I seasoned them with salt, onions, and a little pepper. Then I covered the pan so they could cook through before browning. Next, I began making the pancake batter. In my own kitchen, I would have used a mixer or reached for a prepared mix. Here, I measured the flour, cracked the eggs, added the milk, and stirred everything by hand. At first, the batter was full of small lumps. I kept stirring until it became smooth and heavy. My arm was already getting tired, and I had not even reached the halfway point. That was when I heard the door open behind me. It was Hannah, one of the women in the family. She came in carrying a pitcher of fresh milk and greeted me with a quiet smile. She looked at the pans, the bowl of batter, and the ingredients spread across the table. I expected her to say that I had taken on too much, but she simply asked whether I needed help. I told her I wanted to keep my promise on my own, but I accepted some guidance. Hannah showed me how to control the heat of the stove more effectively and explained that cast iron pans hold heat for a long time. If I waited until the food started burning before I acted, it would already be too late. The sentence sounded as though it was only about cooking, but it stayed in my mind. Some things in life need to be noticed before they become urgent. When Hannah left to help with the other chores, I turned the potatoes and found the first small victory of the morning. The bottoms were golden and crisp. The smell of onions and butter began to spread through the house. Soon afterward, I heard footsteps upstairs. The younger children were waking up, and the pressure increased. I needed to finish everything before the kitchen filled with people. I placed the bacon in another skillet. Space on the stove was limited, so every movement had to be planned. While the bacon cooked, I peeled the apples and cut them into slices. I placed them in a pan with butter, cinnamon, and a little sugar. Soon, the sweet smell blended with the savory aroma of the potatoes and bacon. The kitchen felt too small for so many smells, sounds, and decisions at the same time. Then, the first real problem happened. The pancake batter was thicker than it should have been. The first pancake dropped into the skillet like a block and refused to spread. When I tried to flip it, it broke in half. I stared at that crooked piece, feeling the heat rise in my face. I had imagined round, beautiful pancakes arriving at the table. This looked like a warning that I had taken on more than I could handle. For a moment, I thought about giving up on the pancakes. No one knew they were part of the plan. I could hide the batter, serve everything else, and pretend that the morning had gone exactly as expected. But in that environment, where every ingredient had value and waste was avoided, abandoning an entire bowl felt wrong. I added a little more milk, stirred again, and tried one more time. The second pancake was not perfect, but it stayed in one piece. The third was better. By the fourth, I had finally found the right amount of batter and the exact moment to flip it. From then on, I began working in a sequence. I poured a pancake into the skillet, checked the bacon, stirred the apples, turned the potatoes, and returned to the batter. It was like learning choreography while the performance was already underway. At 5:20, the sky began to change color. Through the window, the darkness was no longer complete. A bluish line appeared above the fields, revealing the fences, the barn, and the outline of a buggy. I saw 2 members of the family cross the yard with steady steps. They had already been working for almost an hour, and I was still fighting to organize breakfast. That changed the way I saw the morning. I was not preparing a surprise for people who were sleeping peacefully. I was contributing one part to a shared effort. While I took care of the food, others cared for the animals, the firewood, the water, and the first duties of the day. No one did everything, but everyone did something. With that thought, I stopped trying to turn breakfast into a perfect presentation. The goal was not to impress anyone. It was to feed them. I paid less attention to the shape of the pancakes and more attention to the eggs, the temperature of the potatoes, and the amount of food. The kitchen became simpler when I stopped competing with the image I had created in my own mind. I cracked the eggs into an enormous bowl. There were so many that I lost count and had to start over. I added milk, salt, and pepper. Then I cut onions and peppers into small pieces. When I poured the mixture into the skillet, the volume looked almost too large. I stirred slowly with a wooden spoon, pulling the cooked edges toward the center. The eggs began to take shape, soft and glossy. I added the vegetables and a little butter at the end. The result did not look like something from a restaurant, but it had color, aroma, and a texture that made me feel relieved. I tasted a small portion and realized that everything was finally coming together. At 5:45, the kitchen was no longer silent. Children came in to get cups. Someone carried in more firewood. A door opened and closed, and quiet voices moved through the house. Even so, no one touched the food. The table had not been arranged yet, and there was a natural order waiting for the right moment. I began placing the serving dishes in the center of the table. First, the potatoes, then the bacon, the eggs, the pancakes, and the apples. I warmed the bread and set it beside the butter and jam. I filled a pitcher with milk and made coffee for the adults. When I took a few steps back, I saw the completed table for the first time. It did not look luxurious. There were no elaborate decorations, sophisticated dishes, or attempts to hide the work behind the food. The skillets were still on the stove. Flour covered part of the counter, and my hands were tired. But the table was full, warm, and ready. That was enough. A little after 6, everyone began to come in. Some came from the barn, while others walked down the final steps of the staircase. Their faces still carried the cold of the morning. Coats were hung up, hands were washed, and chairs were pulled away from the table. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure where to sit, until Hannah pointed to a place beside her. Before eating, the family paused. The conversation stopped. Hands remained still, and the movement in the kitchen disappeared. That brief moment of prayer completely changed the room. After so much effort, no one rushed toward the food as though it were simply the result of an obligation. There was gratitude before the first plate was served. When the meal began, I watched everyone's reactions. One of the children chose the pancakes first. One of the men placed a large serving of potatoes beside his eggs. Hannah tasted the apples and looked at me with a small smile. No one gave a speech, and perhaps that was why each gesture felt more genuine. Soon the table came alive. Plates were passed from hand to hand. Someone asked for more bread. A child spilled a little milk and cleaned it up without turning it into a major problem. The pancakes disappeared faster than I expected, including the ones that were not perfectly round. The bacon was finished, the potatoes grew scarce, and the eggs were served down to the last portion. I had awakened, worried about whether I could make enough food. Sitting at the table, I realized that the most important part was not the quantity. It was the fact that everyone was there at the same time. No one ate while looking at a screen. No one stood up every minute to check a message. Their attention was on the conversation, the food, and the people around them. That did not mean the morning was easy or idealized. There was fatigue, work waiting, and concerns I did not know about. But during that meal, time seemed to belong to the family. Even with a full day ahead, they did not treat breakfast as a disposable break. At one point, one of the older family members asked what time I had gotten up When I answered 4:30, he looked at the table and simply said, "Then you have already lived an entire day before sunrise." Everyone laughed, and so did I. The sentence was simple, but it described exactly how I felt. After the meal, I began clearing the plates by instinct. Before I could lift the first stack, several hands rose to help. The children carried cups, the adults organized the serving dishes, and Hannah filled a basin with water. Within minutes, the table that had required so much effort began to empty. I had imagined that because I had prepared everything, I should also finish everything by myself. But this family did not seem to measure contribution that way. One person started a task, another continued it, and someone else completed it. Work was not used to prove independence. It was used to keep the household running. While we washed the pans, Hannah asked which part had been the hardest. I thought about the potatoes, the heavy batter, and the first broken pancake. But I answered that the hardest part had been accepting that I did not need to control every detail. She nodded as though she understood perfectly. The sun finally appeared behind the barn and entered through the kitchen window. The light revealed the scattered flour, the watermarks, the stacked pans, and the last piece of pancake sitting on a plate. A few hours earlier, all of it had seemed like an enormous challenge. Now, it was only the trace left behind by a shared meal. I stepped onto the porch with a warm cup in my hands. The cold was still in the air, but the fields were already bright. The routine continued. Someone was leading the animals, someone was sweeping the entrance, and someone was preparing to leave. There was no long pause to celebrate breakfast. Life simply moved forward. That was when I understood why the experience had affected me so deeply. I was used to thinking about time as something that needed to be saved. The faster I completed a task, the better. That morning, however, I realized that some things do not become valuable because they are fast. They become valuable because they receive our full presence. Making breakfast for the entire family required waking up in the dark, working carefully, correcting mistakes, and letting go of the need for perfection. It required understanding that food is not only a combination of ingredients. On certain mornings, it is a quiet way of saying, "I thought about you before the day began." My name is Lorena, and I woke up at 4:30 to make breakfast for an entire family. I thought I would be giving them eggs, pancakes, potatoes, and bread. In the end, I was the one who received something. A new way of seeing the work no one applauds, the care that is rarely noticed, and the simple moments that hold a household together. When I went back inside, the kitchen was already clean. The table was empty, the chairs were aligned, and the day was moving forward. There was still plenty to do, but that first mission was complete. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel the urge to rush toward the next task. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to the sounds of the house and breathing in the scent of coffee that still remained in the air. Then I smiled, picked up my coat, and went outside to help with whatever came next. The sun had only just risen, but for me, that morning had already changed everything.